So today I'm going to talk about a concept called knowledge shields, or a theory of knowledge shields. So when we're learning something new, it's kind of the active construction of knowledge into new mental models. So one of the things that can block that is what's kind of defined as knowledge shields. So this is going to be in the context of both talking about when we're kind of instructing new learners and when we've got instructors looking at new knowledge or kind of improving the way they do things or professional development on their behalf. So it's not really just isolated to the domains that I'm going to talk about. It kind of is something that is kind of a human, or it's a human trait or a human sort of behavior sort of thing. So it's across most domains, or you find most people will do it to some degree. Even myself, I've had to overcome a number of knowledge shields, which are kind of, I'll get to explaining them a little bit so that I can take on new knowledge and kind of make sure that what I understand to be true is likely to be true. So it's kind of looking at kind of old mental models or old practice and the barriers to taking on new knowledge or forming new knowledge or improving our understanding. So it's kind of a process of cognitive rigidity or sort of cognitive dissonance where we refuse to believe new information or take on new information. So it's kind of they're in place to protect old knowledge. And this can happen for a number of reasons, kind of like change resistance. We don't take on new knowledge because it kind of can be a threat to our status, identity, the things that we've kind of built up. Okay, it could just be that people are cognitively lazy or mentally lazy and don't want to learn new things. Okay, so there's a whole heap of barriers or resistance or resistant mechanisms that can form these knowledge shields or be used to stop the sort of development or learning of new knowledge. So when we sort of look at it, it's just basically a denial or defensive mechanism that people will use to prevent new learning. So it's kind of what you'll see people do with knowledge shields, or what knowledge shields sort of are, is kind of the downplaying importance or relevance of new information. So you can present new knowledge to somebody or new information and they just downplay its relevance. Okay, they can explain away or ignore contradictory information. So you can present something new that's factual or evidence-based and they find a way to argue against it, or they just argue against it. Okay, they can use authority. So they can argue from a position of authority to try and downplay it or try and prove you wrong or shut down the conversation or kind of shut it down. Okay, they can use bad analogies to try and sort of prevent the learning of new knowledge or sort of considering new information. So they can use sort of things that, this is always what's worked in the past. So, that's what they sort of rely on. It can be kind of ignoring secondary effects, so you can show the impact that the current practice is doing or their current understanding or the knowledge, okay, and they can just choose to ignore that. It can be arguing from special cases, so they can sort of try and demonstrate or use specific cases to argue against the new knowledge or kind sort of deny that its existence or deny that its validity or factual. Okay, they can argue that the principle has restricted applicability, so they can try and sort of talk their way around it from limited experience that it doesn't work. Okay, essentially it's a whole heap of practices that they can use to prevent new learning. Okay, because if they already think that what they're doing is correct, and a lot of us kind of will, we sort of have a number of biases as well that sort of support this, is that what the way we were taught is probably the best way of doing it, and that's the way that they'll do it. So there's a whole there's a whole heap of examples of old models that I've seen where people will use a whole range of behaviors or arguments to try and deny the new knowledge or deny trying to update their current knowledge. So, a couple of examples that I use is I work a lot within kind of tactical training. So sort of two that I come across fairly often in relation to skill acquisition for certain things is kind of, you have to be an expert at that skill before you can teach that skill. Okay. And then people will argue a whole heap of reasons why they don't need to update that knowledge. Okay. When you look at the actual science, the science doesn't really support it, is that having a deep understanding of it is definitely important. But if you're coaching something, you also need a deep understanding of skill acquisition. Biomechanics is helpful, understanding how people learn and how you coach as well. So being an expert is only one of those factors. So people will argue that, if you can't demonstrate it, then people won't learn it. Okay. I'm not really going to say either or. Okay, like most things, it depends sort of thing, but you'll hear a whole range of arguments to try and sort of, where people will kind of reinforce or validate their own opinion on it. Okay, and they sort of won't take on conflicting evidence to show there is a better way of doing it. Okay, another one that I see commonly is kind of, slow is smooth, smooth is fast. And again, it's not really either or, but when you sort of break it down and show people the principles of why that may or may not be the case, again, they'll argue from analogy, they'll argue from experience, they'll put up a knowledge shield to prevent taking on new learning and updating their mental model of how to coach. Okay, and then kind of the last one I'll see is that, I deal a lot in law enforcement, and in that sort of thing, they'll talk about how you have to be a police officer to be able to understand how to train police officers, and then they'll go away and start training human behavior without any understanding of human behavior. Okay, and then when you kind of confront that, or you try and update that knowledge, is they'll use, again, knowledge shields from their experience. You haven't been there, you haven't done it, so how would you know, type of thing. Okay, they're not behavioral scientists, so how would they know? Is kind of an easy counter argument, but you'll end up in this sort of argumentative process where there's no benefit to it. No one comes away as a winner. They just block the new model or new learning. Okay, so one of the issues that these knowledge shields have is they prevent us from improving and prevent us from taking on new learning and prevent us from updating the old mental models that we have that may not be accurate, sort of thing. So if we want to improve our outcomes, we have to replace old models with more or newer or updated models. And quite often the case is, as sort of science starts to delve into these things, is that the science is sort of updated, mental models are updated, and there's a better way of doing things. Okay, just because it works now doesn't really mean it's best practice or it can't be better. So some of the issues with using old models and not being able to update them is that when we're looking at something and we're using an old model to understand it or make sense of it, is that we can come to the wrong diagnosis. So this is both within coaching and within our performers. If we've got people that we're preparing them to perform in complex environments. So a lot of the stuff I do, like I said, is around tactical communities, around sort of first responders, and a lot of that is complex, or it's a complex environment. So if they develop the wrong mental model through training, because we're training through a suboptimal process, is that it can lead them to make the wrong diagnosis in complexity. Okay, they can discount evidence that is there in front of them because it doesn't fit within the mental model. And it's the same with coaching, is that if it doesn't fit within your mental model of what good coaching is or how to coach or the practice that you're relying on, is that people will just discount that evidence, okay, and they just continue doing what they're doing, and they'll get an outcome that may not be best case or best resolution for that situation. Okay, and then they can continue using inappropriate models for the future, okay, without understanding how to upgrade it. So ultimately, it's sort of, when it comes to perception within that environment or perception of how to coach, is that you can have the wrong conclusion. Okay, so ultimately what we're trying to do is improve our coaching, improve their outcomes. So when it comes to getting around these knowledge shields, firstly understanding that we all have them and what they are, and then kind of identifying when people are using knowledge shields to sort of argue for old models or prevent the updating for new models, is that advanced learning kind of requires a flexibility, okay, to apply that knowledge, to firstly to sort of understand that knowledge, translate that new knowledge into mental models, then apply that knowledge. So what we're trying to do more so is be a little bit more flexible in the way that we think, our cognitive ability and perception. So one of the things that we kind of can do, or to think about to get away from that, is think about our training, what we're trying to do in the complex environments that we're working within, from a sort of principles-based theory, or sort of looking at it principally based, rather than using kind of reductive explanations. Because one of the issues is that when we're using reductive explanations is where, and that's kind of where we think we can break down performance into component parts, train them in isolation, then put them together, is firstly, it's mentally lazy, okay, and cognitively we try and preserve a lot of energy, okay. It's much harder to dig down deep into the principles of what's actually going on within an environment, and then how we learn, okay, to perform or develop performers within that. And it's the same with instructing, understanding the principles of how people actually learn, rather than just do training because that's how we've done it before. So we need to use principles rather than that kind of reductive explanation, because a lot of that relies on analogies as well. So it'll be kind of, this is how I was taught, that must be best practice, so this is how I'm going to taught. Or people will use analogies from the past because that's what they did, or use analogies from experience that kind of may have got success, but they don't know whether it was lucky or whether it was good performance. So analogies are helpful in kind of understanding context, but they're not that useful when it comes to sort of delving into principles and getting people to understand those principles and what they mean, and then update their knowledge and apply that into mental models, or use that knowledge into mental models. So we want to start thinking more of a principles-based theory, okay? And we want to use more of a flexible cognitive approach to it because it allows exploration. It's less rigid, so people can start to kind of explore the mental models, see where they don't really apply or where there might be gaps in those mental models, and update those experiences. Okay? Because ultimately, if we're working with experienced performers as well, so people bring a range of experience, and this is kind of where adult learning environments become important, or understanding how they work, is that we want to leverage their previous experience. However, if they've had previous training that's not really adequate, then for new learning to occur, there has to be a process of unlearning old mental models. So there needs to be kind of that flexibly or cognitive flexible approach so that they can update their model or update their knowledge to create more appropriate models that they can apply. And we want them to be able to apply them flexibly as well. So taking on more of a cognitive-based approach, looking at the principles, is going to be a way that we can overcome these knowledge shields. Okay, so like I said, the easiest way to kind of understand it is to listen to what people are saying within your environment and see how they respond to new information and the arguments that they choose to kind of deny taking on that knowledge. So you'll see a number of people, you'll see people in a number of situations. Everyone will do it. I'm guilty of it myself in certain situations. I'll use sort of a cognitively rigid process to deny new knowledge at times. And then you'll sort of sit down and think, okay, well, what if that's true? Because one of the most dangerous things that we can do is kind of believe something to be true, which actually is not so. Okay, so we want to make sure that we're being a little bit more flexible, okay, a little bit more kind of explorative in the way that we look at these things to understand what we think to be true that is not, and how we can update those models. So like I said, have a bit of a listen to the way people talk within your environment, the things that they kind of defend, the things that they deny, okay, whether they're willing to take on new information, because some people are better than others. It's a skill that can be developed like most things. So ultimately we want to identify where we have information that's wrong, understand whether we've got knowledge shields blocking new information, and then get around that. So it's a little bit more of a discussion to get a bit of thinking going. Have a look to see where or if you have knowledge shields and where they are, and how you can kind of get around that. Understand other people's process of it, and just direct conflict is not going to be the best way to go around it. Okay, you need to sort of guide them through it a little bit more, let them go on their own journey of exploration and discovery. Okay, because ultimately, if we're in these environments and we're instructing, we want the best outcomes for our students. It's really irrelevant of how important we think we are as instructors. It's more so on their outcomes. So we want to make sure that we're not a limitation. So there's a little bit of a little bit of a discussion around knowledge shields. I hope that helps you understand a little bit about what they are, kind of where they can be, and help you work out where you're using them. Okay, if you've got any questions on that, please reach out. If you want to do some more reading, there's plenty of research out there. Otherwise, thanks for your attention, and I hope that sort of you got something out of that.